Hello guys, welcome back. So today in this video, we are going to discuss advanced Spring Boot interview questions, and we have already covered 12 questions of basic level for freshers, but this video will be good for experienced Spring Boot developers. So what are the basic annotations that Spring Boot offers? The primary annotations of the Spring Boot offers reside in this package org.springframework.boot.autoconfigure and its subpackages. Here are a couple of basic ones. Let's discuss. @enable auto configuration. To make a Spring Boot look for auto configuration beans on its class path, we use this annotation and it automatically applies them. And then next one is @Spring Boot application. It is used to denote the main class of a Spring Boot application. This annotation combines the @configuration, @enable auto configuration and @component scan annotations with their default attributes. Without changing their attributes, it generally combines all these three annotations. Now the next question is question number 14. What is Spring Boot dependency management? So Spring Boot dependency management is used to manage the dependencies and configuration automatically without you specifying the version for any of that dependencies. Now next is question number 15. Can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? So the question is it mandatory to develop a web application using a Spring Boot? Can't we develop a non-web application? So the answer is yes. We can create a non-web application by removing the web dependencies from the class path along with changing the way Spring Boot creates the application context. So by this way we can create the non-web application. The first thing is to remove the web dependencies which we have included from the class path, and then we need to change the way in which Spring Boot creates the application context. Now next question is question number 16. Is it possible to change the port of embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, it is possible. It can be done by updating the server.port in the application properties file. Now what is the default port of Tomcat in Spring Boot? So the default port of the Tomcat server ID is 8080. It can be changed by adding server.port properties in the application.properties file. So these questions are almost same, just the default port is also mentioned in this answer. Now question 18. Can we override or replace the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, we can replace the embedded Tomcat server with any server by using the starter dependency in pom.xml file. Like you can use a Spring Boot starter Jetty as dependency for using a Jetty server in your project. Next is, can we disable the default web server in the Spring Boot application? Yes, we can do the same by changing it or updating it in the application.properties file, which is used to configure the web application type. Spring.main.web application type is equal to none. We can declare it like this in the application.properties file, and the default web server can be disabled using this statement. Now how to disable a specific auto configuration file? So let's see the question number 20. How to disable a specific auto configuration class? So to disable this, what we can do is we can use the exclude attribute of enable auto configuration, and if we want auto configuration not to apply to any specific class, so we can use this enable auto configuration, exclude this class. We can provide the class name inside this exclude parameter. Next is question number 21. Explain the REST controller annotation in the Spring Boot. So it is a combination of controller and response body which is used for creating RESTful controller. It converts the response to JSON or XML. Now it ensures the data returned by each method will be written straight into the response body instead of returning a template. Next question is question number 22. What is the difference between REST controller and controller in a Spring Boot? So the answer is simple. Controller map of the model object to view or template and make it human readable. So this controller basically map the model object to view or template and make it a human readable, whereas REST controller annotation simply returns the object, and the object data is directly written in HTTP response as JSON or XML. It is not in the human readable form. It is in the form of JSON or XML. Okay. Now the next question is question number 23. So let's see what the question is all about. Question is related to the flow of HTTP request through the Springboot application. So on a high level Springboot application follow the MVC pattern, which is depicted in the below flow diagram. Now Springboot flow architecture. This is the overall representation of Springboot flow architecture. So basically, first of all, we start with the controller. This is a basic Springboot flow architecture. Starting with controller. Controller interacts with the client directly. All the endpoints, all the APIs endpoints are provided in this controller itself, and using the HTTPS and the request mapping, the client can access to these endpoints. Okay, so the first call goes to the controller. After that, controller interacts with the service layer in which all the business logic is implemented. This service layer can interact with the database directly and also with the model. So using model, we use JP or Spring Data to interact with database. Model, or we can say the entity, they are used to interact with the database. And service layer also interact with the repository class extending CRUD services using dependency injections. Okay, so this is all the basic Springboot flow architecture. Now let's see another question, question number 24. What is the difference between request mapping and get mapping? So request mapping and get mapping. As the name suggests, request mapping can be used with get, post, put and many other request methods. It is used for requesting, okay, requesting the data. Now using the method attribute on the annotation, we can just add this @request mapping annotation on the method attribute, and we can use get, post, put or any other request methods on that particular method. Next is get mapping. Get mapping is only an extension of request mapping. Basically, it is an extension of get mapping which helps us to improve on the clarity of request. Get mapping is generally used for get request type. Okay, so we can say that it is a specific type of request mapping to make it more easier for the user to understand. Now next question is, what is the use of profiles in Spring Boot? If you have ever developed a Spring Boot application, you might have seen the profiles. Okay, so what is the use of these profiles? While developing the application, we deal with the multiple environments. Obviously, multiple environments are there, such as dev, QA, prod, and each environment requires a different configuration. Absolutely correct. So in the development life cycle of the project of any application, basically there are multiple environments. You need to understand it. Being a developer, this is the development where the development actually takes place. This is the first step, we can say environment. After that, after the development, this QA is like testing team, and this server is for testing purpose before deploying it on production. After that, this is the final production server on which the user or client interacts with the application and access to it. So each environment requires a different configuration. For example, we might use an embedded H2 database for development, but for production we might having proprietary Oracle or DB2. Even if DBMS is the same across the environment, URLs will be different. So these things are different. To make this easy and clean, Spring has provided the provision of profiles to keep the separate configuration of environments. So this is a use of profile, so that it is easy and clean to maintain the separate configuration of different environments. Now the next question is, what is Spring Actuator? What are its advantages? An actuator is an additional feature of a Spring that helps us to monitor and manage our application when we push it to the production. These actuators include auditing, health, CPU usage, HTTP hits, and metric gathering, and many more that are automatically applied to our application. So these are very much useful when we deploy our application on production. Okay. Now the next question is all about how to enable actuator in a Spring Boot application. Let's see. To enable the Spring actuator feature, we need to add the dependency Spring Boot starter actuator in the pom.xml file. So this is a dependency that we need to add to enable the actuator in a Spring Boot application. Now the next question is, what are the actuator provided endpoints used for monitoring the Spring Boot application? Means what? So actuators provide below predefined endpoints to monitor our application. These are health, info, beans, mappings, config props, HTTP trace, heap dump, thread dump, shutdown. So these are some of the examples of this actuators. Now the next question is question number 29. How to get the list of all the beans in our Spring Boot application? So Spring Boot actuator / beans is used to get the list of all the Spring beans in our application. Question number 30. How to check the environment properties in our Spring Boot application? Spring Boot actuator /env returns the list of all the environment properties of running the Spring Boot application. Next is how to enable the debugging log in Spring Boot application. So debugging logs can be enabled in 3 ways. We can start the application with debug switch. We can set the logging.label.root is equal to debug property in the application.property file, and we can set the logging label of the root logger to debug in the supplied logging configuration file. So these are the 3 ways by which debugging logs can be set. Now the next question is question number 32. Where do we define the properties in the Spring Boot application? We can define both application and Spring Boot related properties into a file called the application.properties file. So the name also suggests that all the properties related information will be provided in this file itself. Now we can create the file manually or using the Spring initializer to create this file. We don't need to do any special configuration to instruct Spring Boot to load this file. If it exists in the class path, then Spring Boot automatically loads it and configure itself and the application code accordingly. So this is the advantage of using this Spring Boot application as a framework to develop the application, different application, right? Now next question is, how do we define properties in the Spring Boot application? Okay, we have done this question. Now the next question is, what is dependency injection? Let's see. The process of injecting dependent bean objects into a target bean object is called dependency injection. Setter injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by calling the setter method. Next is constructor injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by calling the target bean constructor, and the field type constructor is there, in which IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by reflection API. So these are the 3 different types of injecting dependencies into the project. Now the last question of this video is, what is an IOC container? IOC container is a framework for implementing automatic dependency injection. Okay, so we are using it as a framework for implementing automatic dependency injection into our project. Now, it manages object creation and its lifetime, and it also injects dependencies into the class. Okay, so as and when required, we can do this as well. So in this video, we have discussed all the important and advanced level Spring Boot interview questions. And in the next video, we are going to cover Spring security interview questions. These are also important, and being a Spring Boot developer. That's all in this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.